The path had been the same for years, winding between birch and pine, skirting the ridge before dipping toward the creek. But now, just past the bend, a fallen tree blocked the trail. It had come down in a recent storm, its thick trunk covered in damp moss, roots torn from the earth like frozen claws. She might have stepped over it without a thought, if not for the two cubs. They were small, dark, their fur still carrying the scruffy look of youth. And they weren't playing, or foraging, or watching her with the wary curiosity she was used to. They were just waiting. One sat, the other stood, both facing the same direction down the path. When she approached, they didn't move. They simply looked past her, toward the bend behind her, as if expecting someone to appear. The first time she saw them, she thought it was a coincidence. The forest after a storm was full of displaced things, branches, leaves, creatures drawn into new patterns by fallen trees and blocked paths. But when she rounded the bend that morning, there they were, two bear cubs, huddled at the base of a massive trunk that had been torn from the earth. Its roots jutted into the air like a frozen wave, soil and moss still clinging to the tangled mass. The tree had fallen squarely across the trail, its canopy stretching downhill toward the creek. The cubs weren't playing. That was the first thing she noticed. Young bears were rarely still, especially when the air was as crisp and rich with scents as it was after rainfall. But these two stood apart from the patterns she knew. One sat, its front paws resting lightly on the damp ground, ears twitching at every sound. The other stood, head tilted toward the curve in the path behind her, gaze locked on a point she couldn't see. She stopped a safe distance away, not wanting to startle them, though they didn't seem to care about her presence. She had seen bears in these woods for years, mothers with their young, solitary males passing through, and knew the rules of respect. Keep your distance, never block an escape route, and never, under any circumstances, interfere. But these cubs weren't just lingering. They were waiting. She felt it in the stillness between them, in the way their eyes kept flicking past her shoulder as though expecting someone to appear. After a minute, she took a step to the side of the trail, moving slowly, her boots crunching softly on wet leaves. The cubs didn't follow her movement. They stayed fixed on that invisible point. She turned her head, scanning the bend, but the trail behind her was empty, just the soft curl of mist drifting through the undergrowth. She lingered for another few minutes before continuing her walk, though she glanced back twice to see if they'd moved. They hadn't. The next morning, they were there again. Same place. Same positions. She slowed her pace as she approached, noting that the ground around the fallen tree was damp but undisturbed, no signs they'd been foraging or playing between visits. She stopped in the same place as before, a good 15 yards back, and waited. This time, one of them glanced at her, just briefly, then returned its gaze to the path behind her. She turned again, seeing nothing but the curve and the silent forest beyond. On the third morning, she began to feel it in her chest, the weight of their vigil. It was deliberate. They weren't just here because the fallen tree made a good shelter. They were here because they were waiting for someone. That thought lodged itself in her mind for the rest of the day. She replayed the image of them in her head, the stillness, the fixed gazes, the way they seemed to be holding the same invisible thread of attention. She didn't see any sign of a mother bear, which was unusual. Cubs this young rarely stayed alone for long. If she was nearby, she would have expected some sign, a rustle in the undergrowth, a low huff from the shadows. But the forest had been silent. On the fourth day, she arrived earlier, hoping to see if they came from somewhere else before settling in. The sky was just beginning to lighten, the air cool and damp enough that her breath formed small clouds. The trail was empty when she rounded the bend, but the cubs emerged minutes later from the brush downhill, climbing easily over the lower part of the trunk to take their now familiar spots. She realized then how purposeful it was. They didn't hesitate, didn't wander. They came straight to the tree and resumed their positions, eyes fixed down the trail as if resuming a watch that had only been briefly paused. The forest behind her remained still. By the fifth morning, she'd started to wonder who or what they were waiting for. The phrasing came unbidden, he. She didn't know why the word formed so naturally, but it fit. Somehow, in the small movements of their ears and the way their heads would lift at the faintest sound, there was a recognition that felt personal. Not for another cub or a mother, but for someone specific. She began noticing other details. Faint tracks in the mud near the curve, larger than the cub's prints, but lighter than she would have expected from a full-grown male bear. A subtle line through the wet leaves where something had passed more than once. It was on the sixth morning that she thought she heard something. Faint, from far beyond the curve, a single, low huff that carried through the stillness. The cubs reacted instantly, both standing at once, ears forward, bodies tense. She froze, scanning the trail, but the sound didn't come again. They stayed standing for a few minutes, then slowly settled back into their original positions. She walked home that day with the image of them burned into her mind, two small sentinels by the fallen tree, holding their silent vigil for someone she had yet to see. The morning after hearing that faint huff, she woke earlier than usual. She didn't bother with her coffee, didn't linger at the window to watch the light come up. She layered her jacket over her sweater, pulled on her gloves, and set out before the sun had even cleared the ridge. The air was colder this time, sharp enough to nip at the tips of her ears. Frost rimmed the edges of leaves along the trail, and the damp earth had stiffened under the night's chill. Each breath left a faint cloud in front of her face as she moved, her boots muffled by the frozen moss. She rounded the bend expecting to see them, but the fallen tree was empty. Her first thought was that they'd given up, that whatever or whoever they were waiting for wasn't coming back. But then she spotted them, emerging from the same spot downhill as before. Their dark shapes moved with an unhurried purpose, climbing the lower section of the trunk and stepping into their familiar places. They didn't acknowledge her, but she didn't expect them to. She found her own spot a short distance away, leaning against a birch and tucking her hands into her pockets. Minutes passed. The only sounds were the distant rush of the creek and the occasional whisper of wind through the branches. The cubs didn't fidget. They didn't sniff at the air or paw at the ground. They just stared down the trail, completely still except for the subtle twitch of their ears. She realized she was holding her breath without meaning to. There was something about their focus that made her afraid to break the silence. It was nearly an hour before anything changed. A sound reached them first, a faint, rhythmic crunch, so soft she almost thought it was her imagination. The cubs reacted instantly, both turning their heads slightly toward the bend. Their bodies shifted forward, muscles tight but not tense, as though ready to move. She strained to hear, her pulse quickening. The sound grew a little clearer, not hurried, not heavy. Just steady. Then it stopped. The cubs froze in place, their eyes still fixed on the curve in the trail. The silence stretched so long she began to wonder if she'd imagined it. And then, from beyond the bend, came a low, rumbling chuff. She'd been around bears enough to know it wasn't a warning sound. It was recognition. The cubs both stood at once. The smaller one gave a short answering huff, its voice higher but steady. The larger didn't make a sound, but its tail flicked in a slow, deliberate motion. The quiet returned. No footsteps. No more calls. Just the wind shifting through the treetops. After several minutes, the cubs settled back into their original positions, though now they seemed more alert. Their ears stayed angled toward the bend, their eyes tracking every shift of shadow in the mist. She stayed with them until her toes began to ache from the cold, then reluctantly turned for home. But she kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting the figure, bear or otherwise, to appear behind her. The next day, she brought a small folding stool and a thermos of coffee. If they were going to wait, she'd wait with them. The forest was quieter than usual that morning, as though even the birds were holding back their song. She settled into her spot by the birch, the steam from her coffee curling into the air. The cubs arrived a few minutes later, padding silently to their places. For the first hour, nothing happened. Then the crunching sound came again, faint, distant, measured. This time, she noticed something different, a slight echo. The trail behind the bend sloped gently upward, and sound carried strangely there, bouncing off the ridges and dips. The cubs reacted exactly as before, standing, listening, their eyes bright with attention. And once again, a chuff came from beyond the curve. Only this time, it was followed by a low groan. Not an animal sound. Her chest tightened. The cubs didn't move toward it. They stayed by the tree, waiting. She leaned forward in her seat, trying to see around the bend, but the mist was too thick. Whatever was making the sound was still hidden. Minutes passed, and then the groan came again, shorter this time, but more deliberate. The cubs shifted slightly, their paws scraping the damp ground. She thought about standing, about closing the distance to see for herself. But something in her told her not to. This was their moment, not hers. The sounds faded again, leaving only the hush of the forest. When the cubs eventually relaxed, she packed her stool and thermos, walking home with a mind full of questions she couldn't answer. Who was beyond that bend? Why did they stay there instead of going to meet him? And why, after all this time, was she starting to feel as though the cubs weren't just waiting for him, they were also waiting for her to see him? By the third week, her walks had become something else entirely. She no longer treated them as exercise or a way to clear her mind. They were appointments, deliberate, fixed in her day. Every morning, she arrived before the cubs, taking her spot beside the birch tree with her thermos in hand. She stayed until they left, which was always some time after the sun had risen high enough to break through the mist. They never came late. They never skipped a day. And their behavior never changed, straight to the fallen tree, same positions, same focus down the path toward the bend. If she hadn't seen them emerge from the undergrowth that first early morning, she might have thought they'd been there all night. The forest itself began to feel different during those hours. She noticed more, the faint condensation that gathered on the moss-covered trunk, the way frost patterns shifted as the sunlight moved, the distant trickle of the creek below the ridge. Even the air seemed tuned to the cubs waiting, holding itself in quiet suspense. Some days there were sounds from beyond the bend, that slow crunch of footsteps, the low chuff the cubs always answered, or the strange groan that lingered between animal and human. Other days, there was nothing. Just their stillness, and hers. The absence of a mother bear weighed on her mind. Cubs this young should have been under constant watch, and yet she never saw an adult bear anywhere nearby. It was possible, she told herself, that the mother had been lost to a fight, an accident, or something worse, and the cubs were waiting for another family member to return. But there was something deliberate about their vigil that didn't fit that explanation. On the 10th day of her watch, the sound came earlier. She heard the crunch of footsteps from beyond the bend just minutes after the cubs arrived. They reacted instantly, both standing and shifting forward. She held her breath, straining to hear more. The steps stopped, replaced by the low chuff. But this time, the cubs answered in unison, a deep, drawn-out sound that seemed to vibrate through the cold air. The reply that came was different too. Louder. Longer. Her chest tightened. She leaned forward slightly, just enough to catch a glimpse of movement in the mist beyond the bend. It was fleeting, a dark shape shifting between the trees, the kind of movement you couldn't mistake for wind. The cubs stood taller, their ears forward, bodies angled as if ready to move. But they didn't. The figure didn't come closer. After a long moment, the sound of the footsteps resumed, this time growing fainter until they were gone entirely. The cubs settled again. She stared at the bend long after, her coffee forgotten, the steam from the thermos curling away into the air. There had been no doubt in her mind that shape had been real, large enough to be a full-grown bear, but moving with a weight that felt different from the lumbering pace of most adults. The following days followed the same rhythm, arrival, waiting, occasional sounds from beyond the bend, never a full appearance. Then came the first snowfall. It was light, just enough to dust the ground and cling to the fallen tree's moss. The cubs were there, their dark fur standing out against the white. She sat in her usual spot, watching her breath cloud the air. That morning, the sound from beyond the bend was louder than she'd ever heard it. The crunch of steps was heavy now, unmistakable against the snow. The cubs stood at once, tails flicking, and the larger of the two took a step forward. Her eyes locked on the bend. A shape emerged, slow, deliberate, as though stepping through a curtain. The fog and snow softened its edges, but there was no mistaking the figure of a bear. It was broad-shouldered, its fur patchy in places, a scar cutting through the fur on its muzzle. Its eyes fixed first on the cubs, then shifted to her. She froze. The cubs didn't run to it. They stayed still, though every muscle in their small bodies seemed pulled taut. The bear's gaze lingered, then it gave a single, low huff, deep enough that she felt it in her chest. The cubs answered immediately, their voices layered, carrying something that felt less like greeting and more like acknowledgement. The bear held its ground for a long moment, then slowly turned back toward the bend. Without another sound, it disappeared into the mist the way it had come. The cubs didn't move for nearly a minute after. Then they sat again, their gaze still fixed on the empty curve of the trail. She walked home that day with the image of those eyes, steady, measuring, and not entirely unfriendly, etched into her mind. The morning after the sighting, she arrived earlier than usual, a restless energy pushing her along the trail before dawn. The snow from the day before had frozen into a thin crust overnight, crunching softly under her boots. Breath plumed from her mouth in pale bursts as she rounded the bend, scanning the fallen tree. The cubs were already there. It was the first time she'd seen them arrive before her. They stood side by side, their fur bristling slightly in the cold, eyes fixed on the bend with the same unwavering attention as always. But there was something different in their stance, a tension, a readiness, as if the previous day's encounter had shifted the rules. She took her place beside the birch, pulling her scarf higher against the wind. The forest was hushed, as if waiting for something to happen. Even the creek below seemed quieter, its usual trickle dulled by a thin layer of ice. For nearly an hour, nothing moved. Her fingers began to stiffen inside her gloves. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the heat seep into her hands. The cubs didn't budge, and neither did she. Then, faintly, it came, the crunch of snow from beyond the bend. Slow, deliberate. The cubs' ears shot forward, their heads lifting in perfect unison. She leaned slightly to catch a better view. The sound drew closer, more distinct than before. The air between each step seemed to stretch, her heartbeat ticking in the quiet. The figure appeared just as it had the day before, emerging through the mist, the scar on its muzzle catching the weak light. The adult bear stopped several yards from the fallen tree, its breath visible in the frigid air. This time, the cubs took a step toward it. Her pulse jumped. She tightened her grip on her thermos, resisting the urge to move. The bear's head lowered slightly, and it gave a soft, rumbling chuff. The cubs answered in kind, their voices carrying clearly in the cold air. For a moment, it seemed as if they might close the distance. But the adult held its ground, watching them. Its gaze flicked toward her briefly, a glance, not a threat, then back to the cubs. One of the cubs shifted, its paws crunching in the snow. The other stepped back, ears flicking nervously. The bear gave another low huff, longer this time, then turned, moving away with slow, heavy steps. She expected the cubs to follow. They didn't. Instead, they stood at the fallen tree until the sound of its steps faded completely, then sat again in their usual spots. The encounter left her unsettled. The bear hadn't come to them, but it also hadn't ignored them. It felt deliberate, like a ritual repeated over time. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. The adult bear would appear, exchange chuffs with the cubs, and leave. The cubs never crossed the invisible boundary at the fallen tree, and the bear never stepped past it. She began to wonder if the tree itself marked something, a meeting place, a border, a promise. On the 5th day after the first sighting, she caught something new. As the adult bear turned to leave, it glanced over its shoulder, not at the cubs, but at her. The look was brief, but it carried the same weight as before, steady, measuring. That night, she couldn't sleep. The image of that glance replayed in her mind, and with it came a question she couldn't shake. Who, exactly, was the bear coming back for? By the end of that week, her curiosity had hardened into something more deliberate. Watching wasn't enough anymore. She wanted answers. The cub's behavior was too consistent, too measured, to be instinct alone. And the adult bear, its scarred muzzle, the exact distance it maintained, the way it always glanced toward her before leaving, was beginning to feel less like a coincidence and more like an invitation she hadn't yet learned to accept. On the 7th morning after the first sighting, she came prepared. She brought a small camera with a long lens, a notebook, and an extra thermos of coffee. Her plan was simple: document everything, times, sounds, movements, and see if any pattern emerged. The forest was bone quiet when she arrived. Frost clung to the fallen tree, the moss beneath it dulled to a muted green. The cubs emerged from the same downhill path as always, padding to their spots without hesitation. She clicked the camera on, its faint hum sounding loud in the stillness. She kept it low, not wanting to startle them. The first hour passed with nothing but the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. Then came the crunch of snow. The cubs reacted instantly, standing side by side. She lifted the camera, heart thudding, and focused on the bend. The mist shifted, and the broad-shouldered shape emerged, larger now with the clarity of the lens, the scar running jagged from just below its left eye to the edge of its muzzle. She pressed the shutter. The click felt intrusive in the quiet, but the bear didn't flinch. It stopped at its usual distance from the fallen tree, the cubs answering its low chuff with their own. She noted the time, 8:16 a.m. For nearly a minute, the three bears stood like that, their breath steaming in the cold air. Then the adult turned slightly, angling its head toward her. Through the lens, the look was unmistakable, not startled, not wary, but knowing. She lowered the camera, unsettled by the sudden thought that she was no longer just an observer. The bear turned back to the cubs, gave one final chuff, and moved off into the mist. The cubs resumed their vigil without so much as a glance in her direction. She spent the next few days recording every encounter. The timing was never exact, but it always fell between 8 and 9 in the morning. The bear's approach was always from beyond the bend. It never crossed the fallen tree. And it always, without fail, looked at her before leaving. On the fourth day of documenting, the pattern broke. She arrived to find the cubs already standing, their bodies tense, eyes fixed on the bend. The air was sharper that morning, the kind that made her cheeks sting within minutes. She took her place, pulling her scarf high against the wind. The sound came quickly, heavier steps than usual, a faster pace. The cubs stood taller, their tails flicking. The bear appeared sooner than expected, emerging from the mist with its head lowered. Its breath came in sharp bursts, and it made no chuff this time. She felt the change instantly. This wasn't the calm, deliberate presence of the past week. This was urgency. The bear glanced at the cubs, then at her, longer than before, almost as if it were deciding something. Then, for the first time, it stepped forward. The cubs shifted back slightly, not in fear but in acknowledgement, as if this had been agreed upon long before she'd arrived. The bear's massive paws crunched on the snow until it reached the edge of the fallen tree. It stopped there, towering over the trunk, and gave a sound she'd never heard from it before, a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The cubs both looked at her. And for the first time, she had the sense that whatever they had been waiting for wasn't just him, it was this moment. The rain outside was heavier now, thick enough to blur the trees at the clearing's edge into moving smudges of dark. Water ran in shallow rivers across the ground, carrying pine needles and small stones downslope. David pulled his coat tighter, feeling the chill creep in beneath the storm's heat. The larger bear stepped into the clearing first, testing the ground. Her head moved side to side, reading the wind in quick, efficient arcs. The smaller followed, glancing back at David before loping a short distance toward the ridge trail. There was no hesitation in their direction, they were already choosing a path. David gave one last look into the cabin. The fox hadn't moved, but the meat was gone, the wax cloth lying slack where it had been. The tin of water was half empty. It was enough to ease the edge of the worry. He pulled the door halfway closed, more for the sound than the weather. The rain on the roof dimmed as he stepped fully outside. The mud took his boots deep in the first few strides, making him lean forward to free each step. The bears moved with the easy stability of weight distributed by instinct, claws gripping earth where his soles slid. He followed their line, placing his feet in the high parts of their tracks when he could. As they reached the base of the ridge, the wind shifted hard, driving the rain sideways. David knew this pattern. A pressure drop like this meant the storm's center was about to cross the valley. That could bring sudden torrents down the gullies, washing out lower trails. The bears knew it too. They angled upslope, toward higher ground where runoff wouldn't funnel into a trap. Lightning cracked close enough to make the air shake. David caught a brief, perfect silhouette of the larger bear against the sky, head lifted, ears forward, before the light blinked away. He matched his breathing to their steady pace, finding a rhythm in the climb. The ridge path narrowed to no more than 3 boot widths, the drop on his left disappearing into mist and shadow. Water sheeted over the stones, turning them slick underfoot. The smaller bear slowed here, looking back once to be sure he was following, then continuing up. By the time they reached a small plateau, a shelf of granite just below the ridge's true crest, the rain had softened into mist. The air up here was cooler, sharper, holding the scent of wet stone and crushed grass. Below, the valley was still hidden in the storm's belly, the dark green of the forest blurred to watercolor. The larger bear moved to the edge of the shelf, scanning the drop. The smaller stayed closer to David, its breath slow and even now. There was no push for him to leave, but there was a quiet presence in their stance, the same unspoken understanding from that winter fire. David eased his pack down and sat on the flat granite, letting the rain mist bead on his coat. From here, he could see the cabin's clearing far below, a pale shape among the dark pines. It looked like something from a dream, so near and yet unreachable without the path they'd shown him. The bears didn't linger. When the wind shifted again, carrying with it the smell of calmer air from the east, they turned in unison and started back along the higher ridge trail. The smaller gave a final glance, not stopping, but letting the connection hold for a breath, before following. David stayed long enough to watch their shapes dissolve into the fog. Then he shouldered his pack and began the slow, careful descent toward his own trail home. The trail beyond the fallen tree felt different the moment she stepped onto it. The snow here was untouched, no prints, no broken crust from passing deer or foxes. It was as if the forest had been holding this path in reserve, waiting for them. The adult bear led, his heavy frame moving with a quiet assurance that belied his size. The cubs stayed close, one just behind his right flank, the other slightly to the side. She followed several paces back, her breath misting in the cold air, the strap of her camera pressing into her shoulder. They moved deeper into the forest than she had ever gone. The familiar sounds faded, the creek's voice muted, the wind through the birches distant. The only noise was the crunch of snow under their steps and the occasional low chuff from the bear, as if checking the cubs' positions. The light shifted subtly as they walked. The trees here grew taller and closer together, their trunks dark and straight, their branches weaving a dense canopy overhead. The snow that had fallen here was thinner, scattered in small patches where the canopy broke, leaving the forest floor damp and dark in places. After what felt like half an hour, the bear slowed. The cubs matched his pace, their heads lifting, ears twitching toward something ahead. She strained to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then a faint, rhythmic sound reached her ears, a slow, deliberate knock. 3 beats, a pause, then 3 beats again. It didn't sound like woodpeckers. It was heavier, more intentional. The bear led them toward the sound. The trees began to thin, and soon the outline of a clearing appeared ahead. The knocking stopped. She stepped into the clearing behind them, her boots sinking into the soft earth beneath the thin snow. At its center lay another fallen tree, older than the one that had blocked the trail. Its trunk was split in two, hollowed and dark, its roots curled like a massive hand gripping the earth. The bear approached the hollow, his head dipping low to sniff the dark opening. The cubs circled the trunk, their noses close to the wood, paws leaving shallow marks in the snow. She stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching. Something about the stillness of the place pressed against her, a quiet so complete it felt unnatural. The bear turned to look at her. His gaze was steady, unhurried. Then he stepped aside from the hollow. It took her a moment to realize he was making room. Cautiously, she crossed the clearing. The snow underfoot was softer here, and the air held a faint scent of damp earth and something metallic. When she reached the hollow, she peered inside. At first, it was too dark to see clearly. But as her eyes adjusted, she made out shapes, small, irregular, and weathered. She crouched, leaning closer. They weren't stones. They were carved figures, each one a different animal: foxes, deer, owls, and at least half a dozen bears in various poses. Some were worn smooth, others still held the sharp lines of recent carving. She reached toward the nearest bear figure, its surface darkened with age. The wood was cold against her fingertips. Behind her, the adult bear gave a soft, low sound. Not a warning. Something else. She turned her head slightly to meet his gaze, her fingers still on the carving. The cubs had stopped moving. They sat together near the roots, watching her. She had the distinct feeling that she had just crossed another kind of boundary, not marked by a fallen tree this time, but by choice. The bear stepped forward, his massive frame filling her peripheral vision. He didn't come closer to her, but angled his head toward the forest beyond the clearing, as if telling her there was still more to see. The bear moved first, stepping away from the hollow log with slow, deliberate strides. The cubs rose at once and fell in behind him, their small paws whispering over the snow-thin ground. She lingered for a moment, eyes tracing the shapes of the carvings inside the hollow, before pulling herself upright and following. The air felt heavier now, not in weight but in meaning. It wasn't just that she was walking deeper into unfamiliar forest. It was the sense that she was inside a story that had been unfolding long before she arrived. They skirted the far edge of the clearing, passing under a pair of leaning pines whose trunks formed an arch. Beyond them, the forest thickened again, the trees taller, the undergrowth denser. A faint trail wound through, though it was nothing like the clean footpaths she knew. Here, branches snagged at her jacket, and the ground was uneven with roots and mounds of moss-covered stone. The bear never looked back to check if she was keeping up, but his pace seemed measured for her sake. Every so often, he gave a low chuff, and the cubs would pause just long enough for her to close the gap. After 20 minutes or so, the trees began to thin again. She could hear water, not the slow trickle of the creek, but something faster, livelier. The sound grew clearer until they stepped into another small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the earth, its surface broken by chunks of ice and frothy white water. The bear stopped at the bank, lowering his head to drink. The cubs joined him, their tongues darting in quick sips. She knelt a short distance away, dipping her gloved hand into the stream. The water was so cold it burned. When the bears had finished drinking, the adult lifted his head, droplets clinging to the fur along his muzzle. He didn't turn toward her this time. Instead, he angled his body downstream, where the water curved sharply out of sight. He set off along the bank, the cubs trailing close. She followed, her boots crunching against frost-hardened grass. The stream's curve led them to a place where the bank rose higher, creating a sheltered alcove. It was there she saw it, another fallen tree, though much smaller than the others. This one was propped awkwardly against the bank, its branches stripped bare, the wood pale from years of weathering. Beneath it was a narrow opening, just tall enough for the cubs to duck into. The bear stopped before it, giving a short, deep sound. The cubs slipped inside without hesitation. She stepped closer, crouching to see. The hollow beneath the tree was shallow, lined with dry leaves and bits of moss. In the far corner, tucked neatly against the wall of earth, was something that didn't belong, a strip of fabric, darkened and frayed. She reached in and pulled it free. It was stiff from the cold, but as she unfolded it, the pattern emerged, faded blue with a thin white stripe. A shirt sleeve. Her chest tightened. The fabric was too clean to have been buried for long, but too worn to be new. She looked up at the bear. He was watching her now, his eyes steady, unblinking. The cubs emerged from the hollow and pressed themselves briefly against his legs before settling beside him. None of them moved. She held the sleeve in both hands, the cold biting into her fingers even through the gloves. The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint scent, something metallic and faintly sweet, just enough to make her skin prickle. The bear turned away from her then, his gaze fixed deeper into the forest. Without another sound, he began walking again. The cubs followed instantly. She glanced once more at the hollow beneath the tree, then stuffed the sleeve into her pocket and followed them into the mist. They moved in near silence, the only sounds the muffled crunch of snow and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. The adult bear's pace was steady, never hurried, yet purposeful, the kind of gait that belonged to someone who knew exactly where they were going. The cubs kept close, their smaller frames moving like shadows at his sides. The fabric in her pocket felt heavier with each step, its presence both a question and a warning. She wanted to ask, as if the bears could answer, what it meant, where it had come from, who it belonged to. But even in her mind, the words sounded out of place here. The forest grew denser again. Branches reached low, some brushing her shoulders as she passed. The air cooled noticeably, carrying with it the faint tang of running water and something else, the same metallic edge she'd caught earlier, but stronger now. After a while, the trees began to space out, revealing a slope ahead. The bear climbed it without breaking stride, his large paws leaving clear impressions in the thin snow. She followed, her boots slipping slightly on the incline, the breath in her chest turning sharp from the cold. When she reached the crest, the view opened up. Below lay a wide, shallow basin, ringed by bare trees whose branches clawed at the pale sky. At the far side of the basin stood a structure, not a cabin, not a shed, but something older. Its frame was rough-hewn timber, weathered to a silvery gray, its roof sagging under the weight of years. The bear descended into the basin without hesitation. The cubs followed. She hesitated at the top, scanning the open space for movement, but saw none. As she stepped down the slope, the air grew stiller, the faint sound of water now accompanied by a low creak from the building, as if the wood was shifting in its sleep. The bear stopped a few yards from the structure. His head lifted slightly, nostrils flaring, and the cubs mimicked the gesture. Then he turned his head toward her, holding her gaze for several long seconds before stepping aside. It felt like an invitation or a challenge. She approached slowly, each step sinking into the soft ground of the basin. Up close, the building looked even older, the wood pitted and splintered, the edges of its planks softened by time. A single door hung crooked on rusted hinges, the bottom edge chewed away by rot. She reached for the handle. It was cold, the metal brittle under her glove. The door resisted at first, then swung inward with a low groan. The smell hit her immediately, damp wood, old soil, and that metallic tang, sharper now. She stepped inside. The interior was dim, the light from the doorway barely touching the far wall. Against that wall sat a wooden bench, its surface warped and stained. On it lay another piece of fabric, larger than the one in her pocket, a folded shirt, the same faded blue and white stripe. Beside it, half hidden in shadow, was something carved from wood. She stepped closer, her boots creaking against the warped floor. The carving was of a bear, broad-shouldered, with two smaller figures at its side. The detail was finer than the ones in the hollow log, the grain of the wood smoothed by countless touches. She lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of it in her hands. The cubs had come to stand in the doorway, their eyes fixed on the carving. The adult bear remained outside, still and silent. The air in the room seemed to thicken. From somewhere behind the building came a sound, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the frost. She turned sharply, tucking the carving against her chest. The cubs stiffened. The adult bear's head lifted, his gaze locking onto something beyond the corner of the structure. Whatever they had been waiting for was here. The footsteps drew closer, slow but steady, crunching through the frost with a rhythm that carried weight. She stayed just inside the building, her back to the warped bench, the carved bear clutched against her chest. The cubs didn't move from the doorway, but their bodies were taut, ears angled toward the sound. Outside, the adult bear's head followed the approach, his scarred muzzle still, his breath misting in the cold air. Then, through the thin mist curling along the basin floor, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy coat the color of worn pine bark. His steps didn't falter when he saw the bear, though his eyes shifted toward the cubs and lingered there. A thick knit cap covered most of his head, but his face was weathered, the lines deep, the skin tanned in a way that only came from years outside. He stopped a few paces from the bear. The two looked at each other, not with fear, but with the kind of stillness that comes from familiarity. "You kept them here," the man said softly, as if speaking to the bear. His voice was low and rough, the words curling into the cold air. The bear gave a short, deep chuff in reply. The man's gaze shifted to her then, settling on the carving in her hands. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "That's mine," he said. Her grip on the carving tightened. "It was in here. Along with this." She gestured with her chin toward the folded shirt on the bench. He stepped forward, and the bear moved, not blocking him, but placing himself between the man and the cubs. The cubs stayed still, watching. The man stopped again, this time only a few feet from the bear. "I was coming back," he said quietly, his eyes dropping to the cubs. "Just not soon enough." The bear's breath steamed in the cold, the sound of it the only reply. The man looked past him, meeting her gaze. "You've been watching them?" She nodded slowly. "They were waiting for someone. I didn't know who." His eyes softened, though the rest of his face stayed hard. "Their mother didn't make it. They stayed here because this is where I last saw them." Her mind flicked to the fallen tree, to the endless mornings of stillness. "Why didn't you come sooner?" He looked down at his hands, flexing them slowly. "I was hurt. Too far to walk for months. I thought they'd wander, find another path. But," he glanced at the bear, "I guess they weren't alone." The cubs moved then, padding forward until they stood in front of him. He crouched slowly, holding out his hands. They sniffed at him, one pressing its head against his knee, the other lingering a step back. For a moment, the cold and the mist and the weeks of unanswered questions fell away. The man looked at her once more. "You don't need to stay. They'll come with me now." She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the carving. "What about this?" He straightened, his gaze lingering on it for a long beat. "Keep it. You found them. You should have something to remember it by. She glanced at the bear. His eyes met hers for a brief second before turning away, following the man and the cubs as they began walking toward the far side of the basin. She stood in the doorway until they disappeared into the mist, the only sound the soft crunch of their steps fading into the distance. When the silence settled again, she looked down at the carving in her hands. The bear's shape was solid, the cubs tucked at its side, their details worn smooth from touch. Outside, the mist curled low over the ground, moving slowly back toward the fallen tree.